A contractor repairing a crumbling church floor exposed strange, pulsating blue cables running deep into the earth. But when he traced them to a bolted-down confessional and sawed it open, the terrifying secret hidden in the shaft below made him dial the CIA immediately. Drop a comment with where you're watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe to see what's coming up next. The dust that hung in the stagnant air of St. Jude's of the Valley didn't smell like holiness. It smelled like wet rot and the slow grinding death of a bank account. Andy Travis wiped a mixture of sweat and limestone grit from his forehead with the back of a glove that had seen better decades, looking down at the section of altar flooring that had just crumbled under his work boot. He was 52 years old. His knees popped like dry twigs every time he crouched, and he was currently staring at the job that was supposed to save Travis and Son Restoration from becoming just another memory in a town full of them. But looking at the black mold climbing the joists, he had a sinking feeling that St. Jude's wasn't looking for salvation. It was looking for a burial. "It's worse than the bid, Andy," Lewis said. The kid was standing 3 feet away, holding a pry bar like it was a holy relic. Lewis was 24, eager, and possessed the kind of optimism that Andy hadn't felt since before the recession. "The subfloor is practically mulch. Look at this." Lewis jammed the tip of the crowbar into the wood near the communion rail. It went through with a wet crunch, sinking 3 inches deep without resistance. "I see it, Lewis. I see it," Andy muttered, shifting his weight. He looked up at the stained glass above the altar. It was a depiction of St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. Andy felt a grim kinship with the image. "If we have to replace the joists, the margin on this job vanishes. We'll be working for free." "Father Thomas said the budget is locked," Lewis reminded him, helpful as a blister. "Father Thomas says a lot of things," Andy grunted. "Grab the reciprocating saw. We need to cut back to the good wood before we can even think about laying the new oak. And keep your eyes open. A building this old, you never know what you're going to find. Old coins, time capsules, or just more rot." But they weren't going to find coins. They were about to find something that would make the black mold look like a blessing. As Lewis moved to grab the power tools, Andy knelt, running his hand along the cold stone of the foundation where the wood met the wall. He felt a vibration. It was faint, barely a tremor, humming through the soles of his boots and into his teeth. He frowned. The boiler room was on the other side of the complex, and the HVAC system hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. "You feel that?" Andy asked. Lewis paused, plugging an extension cord into the chaotic web of power strips they had rigged up. "Feel what? The draft? Place is leaky as a sieve, boss." "No, the floor. It's buzzing." Lewis laughed, the sound echoing too loudly in the empty nave. "That's probably just the Holy Spirit, Andy, or the subway." "There's no subway in Oak Haven, Lewis." Andy took the pry bar from the kid. He didn't use the saw yet. He wanted to see what was beneath the rot before he started cutting blindly. He wedged the steel tip under a wide plank of dark walnut that ran perpendicular to the confessionals. With a grunt of exertion that tightened the scar tissue on his lower back, he heaved. The nails screamed a high-pitched shriek of rusted iron giving way. The plank splintered, then popped free, flipping over to reveal the dark earth beneath. The smell hit them instantly. It wasn't just the damp earthiness of a crawlspace. It was the smell of ozone. Hot, dry air billowed up from the gap, smelling like a magnified version of the back of a television set. "Whoa," Lewis said, waving his hand in front of his face. "Is there a steam pipe down there?" Andy clicked on his heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting through the dust motes. He leaned over the hole, expecting to see iron pipes or maybe a rat's nest. What he saw stopped his breath in his throat. Lying in a perfectly dug trench, cutting through the chaotic dirt of the 19th century foundation, were not rusted iron pipes. They were blue. Bright, electric, synthetic blue. "What in the hell?" Andy whispered. He ripped up another board, then another. The adrenaline of confusion masked the pain in his back. Within 10 minutes they had exposed a 6-foot trench. Lying in the dirt were 2 massive, corrugated conduits. They looked exactly like the heavy-duty tubing Andy had seen when he did a contract for the new hospital wing 2 years ago. Casing meant to protect high-capacity fiber optics and high-voltage lines, but these were thicker. They were pristine, vibrant, blue against the brown decay of the church's underbelly. And they were hot. Andy reached down, his hand hovering over the plastic. Heat was radiating off them in waves. "Is that plumbing?" Lewis asked, tilting his head. "No," Andy said, his voice hard. "That's not plumbing, that's conduit. Industrial grade. Look at the zip ties." He pointed. Every 3 feet, the 2 blue pipes were bound together with thick, black, heavy-duty cable ties, the tails clipped with military precision. This wasn't the work of a local handyman or a patch job from the 70s. This was recent. The plastic of the ties hadn't even begun to yellow. Why would Father Thomas have industrial power lines running under the altar? Lewis asked. "He wouldn't," Andy said. He stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. The mystery was itching at the back of his brain, the same way a structural inconsistency did before a wall collapsed. "These are running toward the west wall, toward the booths. The confessionals?" "Yeah." Andy looked at the line of the trench. It disappeared directly beneath the massive, ornate oak structure of the center confessional booth, a piece of furniture that had likely sat in that spot since 1895. "Maybe it's for the sound system?" Lewis suggested, grasping at straws. "Lewis, you could power a stadium with the juice running through lines that thick, and the data." Andy trailed off. He looked at the blue pipes again. They were pulsating slightly, a rhythmic thrum that matched the vibration he had felt earlier. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors at the back of the nave creaked open. A slice of daylight cut through the gloom, blinding them for a second. "Mr. Travis." The voice was thin, reedy, and laced with a tremor that Andy had initially mistaken for piety, but now recognized as fear. It was Father Thomas. The priest hurried down the center aisle, his cassock swirling around his ankles. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His skin was the color of uncooked dough, and his eyes darted from Andy to Lewis and finally down to the exposed trench. When he saw the blue pipes, Father Thomas stopped dead. It was as if he had walked into a wall. "What are you doing?" the priest whispered. "I told you, just the surface, just the visible rot." "The rot went deep, Father," Andy said, keeping his voice level. He stepped between the priest and the hole, a subconscious defensive stance. "Subfloor was compromised. We had to pull it up to check the joists, and then we found this." Andy gestured to the blue veins throbbing in the earth. "What is this, Father?" "These are high-voltage lines and coolant ducts. This isn't up to code. Hell, this isn't even on the blueprints you gave me." Father Thomas swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. It's an upgrade. From the diocese, the heating system. It's radiant floor heating. We tried to install it a few years ago, but ran out of funds." Andy looked at the priest, really looked at him. He saw the sweat beading on the man's upper lip. He saw the way his hands were shaking, clasping and unclasping his rosary. Radiant Hedon uses PEX tubing, Father, Andy said softly. It carries water. These are electrical conduits, and they're brand new. There's no dust on them. You are a contractor, Mr. Travis, not an electrical engineer, Father Thomas snapped, his voice cracking. The burst of anger was sudden and desperate. Cover it up immediately. Put the boards back. I don't care if they're rotten, just cover it. I can't do that, Andy said, his own stubbornness hardening like concrete. If I cover up faulty wiring and this place burns down, it's my license. It's my liability. I need to inspect where these terminate. No. The priest stepped forward, almost aggressive. You will cover it now, or you're fired. Do you understand? The contract is void. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Lewis looked at Andy, eyes wide. They needed this money. They needed it desperately. Andy clenched his jaw. He looked at the blue wires, then at the terrified priest. Fine, Andy lied. We'll cover it. But I need to go get some plywood from the truck to bridge the gap properly. Father Thomas let out a breath that sounded like a sob. Good. Just hurry, please. The bishop, he comes tomorrow. It must be tidy. Andy nodded and signaled Lewis. As they walked toward the vestibule, Andy didn't look back. But he wasn't going to the truck for plywood. He was going to wait. 2 hours later, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the valley in purple twilight. The church was locked, the heavy iron bolts thrown, but Andy Travis knew buildings. He knew that St. Jude's had a coal chute door behind the sacristy that hadn't locked properly since 1960. This is breaking and entering, Andy, Lewis hissed. They were crouching in the overgrown hydrangeas near the side of the church. It's not breaking if the door is open, Andy whispered, sliding the rusted iron hatch aside. And it's not entering if we never leave. We're just working late. You know, Father Thomas fired us. He tried to, but he didn't sign the termination paperwork. Technically, we're still on the clock. Andy dropped into the coal chute, landing in a pile of ancient dust. He clicked his flashlight on, keeping the beam low. Come on. I'm not losing my license because the padre is running a grow-op in the basement. You think it's weed? Lewis asked, dropping down beside him. I think blue conduit costs $12 a foot. Whatever is down there, it's worth a lot more than pot. They moved through the basement, navigating the maze of old boilers and stacked pews until they found the service stairs that led up to the altar. The church was silent, but the hum was louder now. In the stillness of the night, without, the traffic outside, the vibration felt like the building was shivering. They crept into the nave. The moonlight filtered through the saints, casting long, distorted shadows across the pews. Andy moved directly to the confessional booth. The blue wires in the exposed trench seemed to glow in the moonlight, leading straight under the heavy oak base of the central booth. Okay, Andy said, his voice barely audible. Help me push it. They braced their shoulders against the dark wood of the confessional. It was a massive piece of furniture, easily 500 pounds, but between the two of them it should have slid. On 3, Andy grunted. 1, 2, 3. They shoved. The booth didn't move a millimeter. It felt like pushing against a mountain. Locked? Lewis panted. Andy shone his light at the base. Bolted. Look. He ran his finger along the floor. Heavy industrial bolts had been driven through the base of the confessional into the concrete foundation. Below, the heads of the bolts were countersunk and filled with wood putty to hide them. "Who bolts a confessional to the floor?" Lewis asked. "They're supposed to be movable." "Someone who doesn't want you to see what's under it," Andy said. He pulled the reciprocating saw from his tool belt. He had brought it back in with him. "Andy, you can't cut up a 100-year-old antique. Watch me." Andy positioned the saw blade parallel to the floor, aiming to slice through the decorative baseboard molding. If the booth wouldn't move, he would go through it. He squeezed the trigger. The saw roared to life, the sound shockingly loud in the quiet church. Andy winced, expecting Father Thomas to burst in, but the church remained empty. The blade bit into the oak, screaming as it chewed through the seasoned wood. Sawdust sprayed into the air. Andy pushed harder, sweat stinging his eyes. The blade hit something metal. A clank, 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 and then punched through into empty space. "Got it," Andy muttered. He completed the cut, creating a 2-foot-wide window in the bottom of the confessional. He killed the saw. The silence rushed back in, ringing in their ears. Andy reached in and pried the cut piece of wood loose. It came away with a crack. They aimed their flashlights into the hole. "Holy Mother," Lewis breathed. There was no floor inside the confessional. The entire bottom of the booth had been cut away. Below it was a shaft. It wasn't a rough hole dug into the dirt. It was a finished, concrete-lined shaft, a perfect square, descending vertically into the darkness. The blue wires from the trench cascaded over the lip of the shaft and ran down the walls, clamped neatly into place. But it wasn't just wires. There was a draft of freezing cold air blowing up from the hole, smelling of antiseptic and ozone. And the sound, the hum, was a roar now. It was the sound of thousands of cooling fans spinning at maximum RPM. "Glow stick," Andy ordered, holding out his hand. Lewis fumbled in his pack and cracked a green chemical light. He handed it to Andy. Andy tossed the stick into the void. They watched it fall. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Clink. It hit a metal grating far below. The green light illuminated a section of the underworld. It didn't look like a church basement. It looked like the inside of a submarine. Brushed steel walls, conduit runs, and a sealed blast door. "That's 40 feet down," Andy calculated. "That's way below the crypts." "What do we do?" Lewis whispered, backing away. "We should call the cops." "And tell them what? That we broke into a church and found a hole?" Andy shook his head. "We need proof. We need to see what's behind that door." He looked at Lewis's GoPro, which the kid used to film time-lapses of their work for Instagram. "Rig it," Andy said. "Tie it to the chalk line. We're going fishing." Lewis's hands were shaking, but he tied the camera securely to the string of the chalk line reel. He hit record, the red light blinking a steady, ominous warning. "Lower it slow," Andy instructed. Lewis spooled out the line. The camera descended, spinning slowly in the void. They watched the screen on Lewis's phone, which was paired to the camera via Wi-Fi. The signal was choppy, the image pixelated, but clear enough. The camera passed the green glow stick on the grating. It slipped through a gap in the mesh. The view opened up. Andy gasped. The camera was dangling in a massive, cavernous room. It was an underground hangar, but instead of planes, it was filled with rows and rows of black monoliths. "Servers," Lewis whispered. "It's a data center." "Look at the markings." Andy pointed at the small screen. On the side of the nearest server rack, stenciled in this dark white paint, were letters. They weren't English. They were Cyrillic. Object 9. The camera spun. Further. It caught men walking in the aisles below. They weren't priests. They were wearing white lab coats and carrying tablets. Armed guards with compact submachine guns stood at the end of each row. "That's not a heating system," Andy muttered, a cold chill seizing his chest that had nothing to do with the draft. "That's a server farm, a massive one. Why put it here? Because it's a sanctuary," Andy realized, the horror dawning on him. Diplomatic immunity doesn't apply to churches, but privacy laws do. And who suspects a failing church in the Rust Belt of hosting a foreign intelligence hub? It's the perfect cover. The power draw is hidden by the old grid. The heat is explained away. Suddenly, the image on the phone screen jerked. On the display, one of the guards below looked up. He looked directly into the lens of the GoPro. He shouted something, soundless on the video, and raised his weapon. The screen went black. "Pull it up," Andy yelled. "Pull it up now." Lewis frantically reeled in the line. They saw it. They saw the camera. "Forget the camera." Andy grabbed Lewis by the collar of his jacket. "Run!" They scrambled away from the confessional just as the heavy oak doors of the church, the ones they had bolted from the inside, shook with a massive impact. Someone was trying to get in. "The side door," Andy shouted. They sprinted toward the sacristy, but as they rounded the altar, the lights in the church slammed on, blinding, floodlight bright. "Stop right there." The voice didn't belong to Father Thomas. It was accented, precise, and cold. Andy skidded to a halt. Standing by the sacristy door was a man in a gray maintenance uniform. He held a pistol with a silencer attached to the barrel. It looked absurdly professional against the backdrop of the peeling church plaster. Another man emerged from the choir loft stairs, blocking their retreat. "We're just contractors," Lewis squeaked, putting his hands up. "We were just fixing the floor." "You saw?" the man with the gun said calmly. He began to walk toward them. "You saw the understructure." "We didn't see anything," Andy said, stepping in front of Lewis. "Just pipes. We don't know what they are." The man smiled, a humorless twitch of lips. "You dropped a camera. You know exactly what they are." The heavy front doors finally gave way, bursting open. Father Thomas stumbled in, flanked by two more men. The priest was weeping openly now. "I told you," Father Thomas wailed at the gunman. "I told you to let me handle them. They are good men." "They are liabilities," the lead gunman said. He gestured with the pistol. "Downstairs, both of you." "No," Andy said. He grabbed a heavy bronze candlestick from the altar, one of the few things of value left in the church, and swung it with all the desperate strength of a man who spent 30 years swinging hammers. The heavy brass base caught the gunman in the wrist. The pistol clattered to the floor. "Run, Lewis! The bell tower!" Andy roared. Lewis didn't hesitate. He bolted for the narrow spiral staircase that led up to the bell tower. Andy shoved the gunman backward into the communion rail and followed his apprentice, his boots slipping on the polished stone. Shots popped. Thwip, thwip, chipping the stone archway as they dove into the stairwell. Andy slammed the heavy iron gate of the tower stairs shut and threw the bolt. It wouldn't hold them forever, but it would buy them minutes. They scrambled up the narrow, winding stairs, lungs burning. "My phone," Lewis gasped, pulling it out as they reached the belfry platform. "I'm calling 911. He stared at the screen. "No service? How is there no service? I had bars downstairs." "Jammers," Andy wheezed, leaning against the cold brickwork. The massive bronze bell hung above them, silent and brooding. They'd jammed the signal as soon as they knew we were here. They can't let us broadcast. The sound of metal cutting into metal echoed from below. They were cutting through the gate. "We're trapped," Lewis said, sliding down the wall, terror making his face slack. "They're going to kill us, Andy. They're going to kill us and bury us in that hole." Andy looked out the louvers of the belfry. The town of Oakhaven lay below, asleep. Street lights flickered. No one knew they were up here. "Think, Andy, think," he muttered to himself. He looked at the bell. The rope had been cut years ago to prevent kids from ringing it. He couldn't signal the town. He looked at Lewis's phone. No signal. Then he remembered. "The priest," Andy said. "When he ran in, he dropped something." "What?" "In the vestibule earlier today. I saw him with a phone, a bulky one, satellite phone. He put it in the pocket of his cassock." "Andy, the priest is downstairs with the guys with guns." "I know," Andy said. He looked at the external scaffolding. St. Jude's was undergoing roof repairs on the north side. A different contractor, a cheaper one. The scaffolding ran right past the belfry window down to the sacristy roof. "The jammer works on cell frequencies," Andy said, his mind racing through the specs he knew about RF interference from his brief stint on cell tower jobs. But sat phones use a different uplink. If I can get that phone... "You're going to climb down the outside? I'm going to climb down, knock Father Thomas out if I have to, and get that phone. I'm coming with you. No, you stay here. Make noise. Throw bricks down the stairs. Make them think we're cornered up here." Andy didn't wait for an argument. He squeezed through the louvers and stepped onto the swaying scaffolding. The wind whipped at his jacket. He was 50 feet up. One slip meant death. He moved fast, muscle memory taken over. He slid down the vertical supports, ignoring the burn in his palms, reached the sacristy roof, landing with a soft thud on the slate tiles. He crept to the skylight, looking down into the sacristy. Below, Father Thomas was sitting on a bench, head in his hands. He was alone. The gunmen were all at the tower, focused on cutting the gate. Andy saw the phone. It was sitting on the table next to the holy water font, a heavy, black iridium satellite phone. Andy looked around. There was no way to open the skylight silently. He took a breath. He grabbed a loose slate tile. Smash. Glass rained down into the room. Father Thomas jumped up, screaming. Andy dropped through the hole, landing on the table. He rolled, ignoring the glass shards slicing his hand, and grabbed the phone. Father Thomas stared at him, eyes wide. "Andy, please." "Why, Thomas," Andy rasped, pointing the phone at him like a weapon. "Why?" "The debt," the priest sobbed. "They promised to pay off the mortgage. They said it was just data storage. Corporate. Backups. I didn't know it was them." "You knew enough to hide it," Andy spat. He punched the power button on the phone. It lit up. Searching for satellite. "They're coming," Father Thomas hissed. "Go." The door to the nave burst open. The lead gunman stood there. He didn't hesitate. He raised his weapon. Andy dove behind the heavy oak vesting table just as bullets chewed up the wood. Connection established. Andy didn't know the number for the CIA. He didn't know the number for the FBI. He dialed 911. 911, what is your emergency? "This is Andy Travis at St. Jude's Church. There are armed men here, foreign nationals. There's a server farm under the church. Code red, terrorist activity. Get the feds here now." "Sir, calm down." "What?" "Listen to me." Andy screamed into the receiver as another bullet shattered a vase of flowers next to his head. They have automatic weapons. They are jamming cell signals. This is a national security threat. Send the cavalry! He threw the phone across the room just as the gunman charged. Andy tackled the man at the knees. They crashed to the floor. The gunman was younger, stronger, trained. He hit Andy in the face with the pistol butt. White light exploded in Andy's vision. He tasted blood. He felt a rib crack. The gunman stood over him, leveling the barrel at Andy's chest. "A valiant effort, Builder," the man said, "but useless." Father Thomas stepped in front of the gun. "No," the priest shouted. "No more blood in this house." "Move, priest," the gunman snarled. "You will have to shoot me first." For a second, the gunman hesitated. That second was all it took. A sound like thunder ripped through the air. But it wasn't a gun. It was the sound of the front wall of the church exploding. An armored Bearcat vehicle rammed through the double doors, sending splinters of oak flying like shrapnel. Flashbangs detonated. Boom! Boom! Filling the air with blinding white light and deafening noise. "Federal agents! Drop your weapons! Get on the ground!" Men in tactical gear poured through the breach, laser sights cutting through the smoke. They moved with a violence of action that overwhelmed the room instantly. The gunman turned to fire at the SWAT team. He took 2 rounds to the chest and went down. Andy lay on the floor, gasping for air, watching the boots of the tactical team swarm past him. He saw them secure Father Thomas. He saw them run toward the tower to get Lewis. He rolled onto his back, looking up at the hole in the roof he had made. The stars were visible. "Told you it wasn't plumbing," he whispered to no one. The sun was rising by the time the chaos settled. St. Jude's looked like a war zone. FBI trucks, CIA black vans, and local police cruisers filled the lot. The entire block was cordoned off. Andy sat on the tailgate of an ambulance, a paramedic taping up his ribs. Lewis was next to him, holding a cup of coffee with 2 hands, still shaking but grinning like a maniac. "Did you see the drill?" Lewis asked for the 10th time. "They had a diamond-tipped core drill. They went right through the foundation." A man in a sharp suit approached them. He didn't look like a cop. He looked like an accountant who killed people for a living. "Mr. Travis," the man said. "Agent Miller, CIA." Andy nodded, wincing. "Agent, you have a good eye for structural anomalies," Miller said. The facility below was significant. A hostile state actor was using it as a relay node for cyber espionage targeting the eastern power grid. They were siphoning power from the grid itself to run it. "And the priest?" Andy asked. "Father Thomas is in custody. Treason is a heavy charge. He claims ignorance, but willful blindness is not a defense." Miller looked at the church. "We have to dismantle the facility. It's going to take weeks. The foundation is compromised." "It was already compromised," Andy said, taking a sip of water. "Rot goes deep." Miller pulled a card from his pocket. "The Historical Society is going to be very interested in preserving what's left of the building once we're done. The government has a fund for restoring sites damaged during national security operations. I'll make sure your name is on the top of the list for the contract." Andy took the card. "I'm expensive, Agent. I don't use cheap materials." Miller smiled. "I think we can afford you." Weeks later, Andy stood alone in the nave of St. Jude's. The servers were gone. The blue wires were gone. The hole in the floor had been filled with fresh, reinforced concrete. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass, coloring the dust motes red and gold. It was quiet. A true quiet, not the humming silence of the machine. Andy knelt down. He picked up a piece of the new white oak flooring he was about to install. It was solid, heavy, and real. He placed the board over the scar in the concrete. He took his hammer, feeling the weight of it, the balance. Measured twice, cut once, he murmured to himself. He drove the first nail home. It rang out, a clear, clean note that echoed against the stone, signaling not an end, but a restoration. The foundation was solid again, and this time he knew exactly what was underneath it.